So let me tell you a story about a man named Gilbert Baker. In 1952, Gilbert was born in the small town of Chanute in northwest Kansas. His dad was a judge, his mom was a teacher. When he was 18, he was drafted into the Army, became a medic, and was stationed in San Francisco in 1972 when he was honorably discharged. He decided to stay in San Francisco, which at the time was one of the few places in the world where gay people, like Gilbert, could live openly and find community and belonging. Gilbert became an activist, and he also learned how to sew. He created banners for marches and for gay rights and other causes and for political campaigns, and that's how he met and became friends with Harvey Milk, the first openly gay person in California to be elected to public office. In 1978, Gilbert worked with some volunteers to create homemade dyes using the colors bleached from their own clothes. They dyed fabric, cut the different pieces of fabric into strips, stitched them together, and created one of the most universally recognized symbols in the whole world, the rainbow flag. Gilbert refused to trademark that design. He said this about the flag. What I like about the rainbow is that it fits all of us. It's all the colors. It represents all the genders. It represents all the races. It's the rainbow of humanity. What Gilbert said about that, representing the rainbow of humanity, is something these days I think is crucial for us to remember and to affirm about humanity. That we're all unique, but we're also all of one piece, stitched together. It's important because we've got a lot of angry voices in our culture today who are fearful of losing their perceived place in the pecking order, who believe that it's natural for one color of people, type of people, one religion, one political philosophy to dominate all others. They can even believe that their cause is a holy one, informed by a small kind of faith. It says God categorizes people as either insiders or outsiders, as accepted or rejected. But I choose to believe the God of the rainbow, a God whose covenant relationship is with all of us. Now, the rainbow flag itself is obviously a symbol of gay pride. 4 years ago at Salem, when we went through a process called Open and Affirming, we held several discussion sessions and a Bible study we called What Does the Bible Really Say About Homosexuality? We watched and discussed documentaries. I spoke with a lot of members privately, and together we learned what it would mean for us to call ourselves an open and affirming congregation in the United Church of Christ, our denomination. It's not that gay people weren't already welcomed at Salem, they certainly were, and it's not that Salem would become a gay church, whatever that means. The point of being open and affirming is to declare to yourself as a group and to declare to the larger community the church serves that people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and anyone who doesn't fall neatly into the category of straight can be here just who they were created by God to be. They'll be welcomed, accepted, loved, and they'll be expected to pitch in and do their part, just like everybody else. In fact, they're not considered they at all, but us. Just another one of us who are doing the work of loving and serving God by loving our neighbors as ourselves. Because historically and even today, the Christian church as a whole has not exactly been very welcoming to gay people. More often, it's been something you had to keep under wraps, or the church has even been downright hostile, often pulling one of those 14 or so references to homosexuality from the Bible completely out of context, or conveniently ignoring its original meaning and intent to justify beating gay people up, often literally, with a warped self-righteous indignation, believing that God categorizes people as either insiders or outsiders, as welcomed or rejected. Plenty of gay folks I've known have been seriously traumatized and made to feel like damaged goods, or told that God hates them, all in the name of a faith that's supposed to be about loving each other. I can't think of a worse kind of blasphemy than that. So it's little wonder that a ton of people, gay and straight, they just don't want to have anything to do with a faith that practices that kind of bald-faced hypocrisy. But sadly, that's been the case for so long that many folks out there just assume that if you call yourself a Christian, well, you must be homophobic. which would be news to the millions of gay Christians out there. It would also be news to Jesus, who had every opportunity in the world to be quoted about his thoughts on homosexuality, but he apparently didn't think it was even worth his time to mention. Instead, he mentioned many times that any religious doctrine is a bunch of baloney if it's out of sync with the most important principle of all, and that is unconditional love. So that's why Salem flies the rainbow flag that's designed by Gilbert Baker, along with other open and affirming churches. It's a statement, it's a sign. It says to everyone, whether you're straight or gay, that we don't presume to place any limits on the welcoming love of God that knows no limits. And it's a powerful reminder of a promise made very long time ago of how God sees all of us in a covenant relationship, a connection and belonging to God and to each other. Whenever we're reading the story of Noah's Ark, we're firmly in the realm of mythology. Many cultures in ancient times, the Chinese, Mesopotamians, Greeks, Hindus, Polynesians, Aborigines in Australia, Persians, Babylonians, they all had myths of a great flood in antiquity. It was a good way of explaining how things came about. Now, some people think that's proof that an actual flood, just like the one described in Genesis, really happened. But our modern scientific understanding of geology and paleontology says otherwise. Myths are not intended to be historically accurate accounts, but stories that tell us something about who we are. So they might not be the literal truth, but they contain truths nonetheless. Now, the truth that the writers of Genesis were describing was that God's covenant relationship was for all people, and the rainbow was the sign of that. Today, when we think of a covenant, we might compare it to a legal contract. For instance, in the place where Ellen and I live, everyone signs off on a covenant that says we cannot do certain things. So we can't hold a rummage sale. We can't hang Christmas lights. We can't install a clothesline outside. So it's kind of a bummer because this covenant really restricts my creativity. But agreeing to that everyone's place ought to look exactly the same and really boring from the outside that's what we signed up for. So I guess I can't complain. Or we can think of a covenant in a more significant way, like getting married. Marriage is a legal thing, but most people understand that it's a whole lot more than that. It's a commitment to live in a relationship of mutual caring and sharing and support and loving. So at least in a healthy marriage, the covenant aspect of it is a whole lot more significant than the advantages of filing your income taxes jointly. That's why fidelity matters. If one of the partners is not faithful to the covenant in one way or another, then trust is broken. But the covenant described in the rainbow story in Genesis, it isn't a contract, and it isn't even a commitment between two parties to behave in ways that honor and respect and care for each other. The closest thing that comes to it is a type of treaty that ancient Israelites would have been very familiar with, a covenant between a powerful nation and a weaker one, with the weaker nation paying tribute in exchange for the protection of the stronger, very common in those days. Even then, the rainbow covenant following the flood wasn't even quite like that. It wasn't between nations. It's a covenant between God and all of humanity. It's a promise, and it's a one-way promise. In the story, God asked for absolutely nothing in return. Now, for a lot of us, if we're honest, that's a hard thing to wrap our minds around, because in most relationships, we expect for there to be some reciprocity. If we're receiving something, that means we're then expected to give something back. Because just to get a gift with no qualifications to it, that feels way too generous to believe. It's far too easy. Got to be a catch there somewhere. In this story that tells us about the nature of God, though, there is no catch. So let's think about the whole story leading up to the rainbow. You've got an infinitely powerful presence who creates everything, but then eventually gets fed up with how people are behaving, and then decides to wipe the slate clean and start over with one man named Noah and his family, and just enough wildlife to get things going again. To do that, God returns the earth to the way things were before creation, a watery chaos, to give creation a second chance. If God was a software engineer, this would be Planet Earth, version 2.0. After the waters had subsided, after Noah and his family and all the animals had left the ark, God only gives Noah 2 rules to live by. And oddly enough, the first rule was to make sure you cook your meat thoroughly before you eat it, which, that's a good basic food hygiene thing. And this was way before the invention of sushi, so I don't think that counts. Anyway, kind of an odd thing to say after everything that's just happened, but there it is. It's in the Bible. The second rule, though, was much more substantial. Don't kill people. Because after all, God says people are made in my image. In other words, human beings are in me and I'm in them. Other than that, be fruitful and multiply. Have yourself a good time. The thing is, the covenant, the promise God was about to make, wasn't even contingent on following those 2 rules. God simply says, I promise you this. Nothing like this flood's ever going to happen again. I'm done starting over from scratch. And when the rainbow's in the clouds, I'll see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. Now, we've heard that story so many times, it's hard to take in the full scope of it. On the surface of things, it seems to be just about promising to never again cause such a destructive flood. So we have to wonder, well, why not? If God's that powerful, then why not just hit the reset button every so often whenever things go south and people start misbehaving? What's changed? The only conclusion we can draw is God's changed. Those storytellers, those myth makers never tell us exactly why. They only make it clear that it's God's prerogative to do whatever God does. And in this story, what God does for the first time is to give a one-way, everlasting, for all-time promise, a covenant with everybody and everything, no exceptions, no qualifications. And the rainbow, all the colors in the spectrum of creation, encompassing everything and everybody, is God's own reminder of that covenant relationship. The essential nature of God, the ancients are telling us, is to choose to make us and all of humanity a promise that never ends, that has no conditions, and that includes everybody. If the folks who took that myth of a great flood and made it their own, and who told it and retold it around campfires to their children and their children's children, and who later wrote it down so that one day you and I would know it really well, if they believe that story describes the essence of God, I'm good with that. Because Jesus took that very same story and he made it his own. The true story that we are created in the image of holiness, that we're to do no harm to others, that we're created to enjoy this earth and this life, and that God's covenant is unconditional and it extends to everyone in the spectrum of humanity. The same thing Gilbert Baker said about the rainbow flag, Jesus taught and showed was true about God's love. Gilbert said, it fits all of us. It's all the colors. It represents all the genders. It represents all the races. It's the rainbow of humanity.